we don't have our full lineup today. Anyways, but we'll start off because I'm conscious of the commitment you're putting today, Shaun, in the evening. So thank you very much. In general, I think everyone had an opportunity to read a little about you, Shaun, but I've gotten to know you both in a capacity as a participant and as a judge, both in Clifton. It was two magnificent worlds that I attended, both as a participant and a judge, both extremely welcoming, slightly different in alcohol content, but that's not the important. That's not the important bit, I guess. Overall, Shaun, the reason why I've asked you to do the prepared session is because over the years I've gotten to know how much you know and the level of knowledge you hold in your possession regarding persuasive and after dinner speaking. Of course, results speak for themselves. 2014, I remember Brendan pulling that magnificent performance, and you've mentioned that in your intro how proud you are of that moment as his coach. So it's not only that we love South Africans in Lithuania, but we learn from them a little as well. So with that, I leave it to you, Shaun, and feel free to share a little of your expertise, firstly through some slides, and then we can do a general Q&A session.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege and an honor to be asked to present on persuasive speaking, a category I don't always like judging, but I always end up judging. I always get speakers in after dinner, so I can never judge after dinner. Yeah, and you also made me feel old, Chris, because I forget that you're a participant back in 2013, and then you come back as a coach in 2015. Fantastic. So let's get directly into it. Let me just share let me see if I can find the PowerPoint, and then we can get going. Just sort of, let me just check. There we go. Just checking. There we go. Can you just, okay, I should be sharing now. Please just confirm.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I think prepared is quite an interesting one because it's obviously the only category that is made up of two different sections and two very, very different ones at that, each with their own challenges. So I think prepared is challenging from the respect that it's quite a long speech, or potentially can be a very long speech. But generally, in terms of potential subject matter, I think there's quite a lot of material out there. After dinner, on the other hand, whilst it's almost half the length, 5 to 7, is challenging in that a speaker needs to be humorous and needs to be able to sort of tussle with the language a lot more. So I think each has its own challenges, and hopefully what we can do is we can sort of extricate and sort of find sort of a way through how we deal with those challenges. So just sort of referencing sort of the PowerPoint here, when we're looking at a persuasive speech, in its very simple terms, it of course is a problem solution approach. Okay, as it says, the humor can be incorporated, which is great because sometimes I think persuasive speeches from a judge's perspective can be quite draining, because when you're asked to present a problem solution, I think that the natural go-to are sort of the problems around us. And the problems tend to be quite sort of weighty problems that are impacting humanity in quite a negative way. I suppose that is the nature of a problem. So where I suppose a little bit of levity can be introduced within a problem, I suppose that would be a good thing. But I think just by the nature of a problem solution approach, introducing humor can be challenging because it has to come at the right point. But I suppose that depends on the nature of the problem. So identifying the actual problem, what is quite interesting about identifying the problem is that there are two different types of problem. One, a problem that is current, in other words, something that is happening now. But the other alternative is a potential problem, a future problem. And both options, whether you sort of choose a problem that exists in the world today or potentially will something that will become a problem in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time, they do not necessarily need to be that well known. Okay, But I suppose on the other hand, it could be something that is very, very well known. And therein lies the sort of the one of the first obstacles that a persuasive speaker needs to address. What is that problem that they are going to be looking at? Is it a current problem? Obviously, the point is you're not going to choose a problem that has existed and has been solved. Okay, it's an existing problem or a problem that's going to be or an issue, perhaps more correctly, an issue that will become a problem in the future. Then the speaker has to decide how they are going to approach that problem and then, of course, the solution. So it's not a 50-50 split. So it's not that you will spend 50% of your time talking about the problem and then 50% of the time offering the solution. The ratio of time to problem solution, right, depends on the nature of the problem. So if a speaker is going to be choosing a problem that is perhaps very, very well known, sort of climate change, for example, you're probably not then going to spend a lot of time trying to persuade people that climate change is a problem. By the same token, you can't assume that everybody knows about it. So you're still going to have to spend some time sort of delving into the problem. But in a case of a problem that is perhaps has universality, you're going to want to spend more of your time talking about the solutions, perhaps innovative solutions that you might have to that problem. On the other hand, something that is less well known, either because we don't know it's a problem or it's something that's going to become a problem, you're probably going to then want to spend a lot more time on that problem, and perhaps the solution is quite straightforward. A good illustration would be that I think actually in Lithuania, I think in about 2010, a Pakistani speaker spoke about drinking too much water after exercise is actually quite dangerous. Right? And she went into quite a lot of detail as to what happens physiologically when you drink too much water after exercise, which can prove fatal. Therein, the solution itself was a relatively simple one, which is don't drink too much water after you exercise. Of course, it wasn't simply one liner, but just to illustrate how a problem solution isn't 50% of your time problem and 50% of your time on the solution. It all depends on the problem you've chosen and how you attempt to approach the solution. Probably you will end up with something that is relatively even, but like I said, it always depends on the problem. The less well-known the problem, the more time you've got to spend on it. The more well-known the problem, that allows you perhaps to spend less time on it and more time on the solution. So in terms of, I've spoken about 50% of time or various ratios of that. So persuasive speaking has a weird duration of 7 to 13 minutes. And if you read sort of the rules, it's actually a 10-minute speech with a 3-minute leeway, okay, which means that it has to be a minimum of 7 and a maximum of 13. So if you're at 6:59 or 13:01, you're going to be penalized on either side of that. So I think the best, I don't think there is ever an ideal length to a speech, okay? But just from a judge's perspective, a lot of the time we've made up our minds probably about 3/4 of the way through the speech. Perhaps not the exact mark or perhaps not the exact ranking, but we've got a sense of that particular speaker. And that goes for persuasive and it goes for after dinner. So I don't think there's any relative advantage in speaking to full-time in a persuasive speech. That doesn't mean that if you do speak to 12:59 that somehow you're going to be penalized because you're speaking to full-time, right? I've seen speakers manage to get 13 minutes on the dot, which is quite incredible, and that takes a lot of sort of practice. So I don't think it's necessary to speak to full-time. I do think 7 minutes for a persuasive speech is probably too little. So I think you would want to be in a very safe margin, which is probably more than 10 minutes, but perhaps less than 12:30. Because I always think in any speech, once again, whether it's persuasive or after dinner, you always do want a little bit of time on your side, because the last thing you want is to deliver a well-researched or well-practiced speech, and nerves make you speak faster, and and you way under time, or maybe the nerves slow you down so much that you speak over time, and you lose points, because it's the last thing that you want to happen in this competition, because that can sort of knock you out of a potential break round, because the time penalties are quite severe, and it can go up to 10 points. So just be very conscious of that. Okay, so I think 10 to 12, 30, 12, 45 is good. Always have a little bit of a buffer before the maximum time, unless you're very, very confident that you have rehearsed your speech so well that you can hit 12:59, 13 minutes exactly, right? Because you don't want to go over even like 2 seconds after 13. You're going to lose some, so there's going to be some sort of penalty. Your persuasive or your after dinner, and I'll probably repeat myself, is the same speech in round one and round two. If you break to a semi-final or a quarter-final, or you make the grand final, it's exactly the same speech. Most competitions, and this goes for every category, and I'm sure you know this already, round one, you get given some sort of feedback. This is what you did well, and this is what you can improve on. And it seems that next year in KL, there is time between the speeches to be able to add to it. But I think as a speaker, you've got to be pretty confident in the speech that you deliver, whether it's a persuasive speech or an after dinner, because one of the problems with getting feedback from judges, particularly if it's a panel of 3 or 4, you might get 4 different opinions from the particular panel, and you might be in a position where one judge says, "I really liked the way you delivered," and another judge goes, "I think you can improve upon your delivery." So I think that the feedback you get given at the end of round one, and potentially in round two, if that is what happens next year, you've got to be pretty judicious about it. If you're confident in your delivery, if you're confident in your material, then that's fine. It's up to you whether you choose to implement the feedback that is given at the end of any speech, whether it's persuasive, after dinner, or any other category. But it can be very, very, very confusing to a speaker when you get contradictory advice from the same from panelists within the same room. And there's very little you can do or should be doing. So it's unadvisable to rewrite a speech. You want to tweak it a little bit. Maybe you can work on presentation a little bit. Maybe you can add 1 or 2 things, particularly in a persuasive, if a judge says, I felt that you could have added this to your solution, or, perhaps extrapolated your problem a bit more. But there's not a lot you're going to be able to do, because remember, adding to a speech means that you've then got to relearn your speech. And that in itself could be problematic in the next round, because now you've got to remember what you added in and where you added in. So just be very cautious about what advice you follow and what advice you implement into your speech. Because remember, at the end of the day, the judging in this competition is very subjective. It's how you appealed to a given judge in a given moment, right? Which could be very, very different to the judge that is sitting right next to that individual. So be very, very judicious about the feedback, that how you take the feedback, okay, and what you do with that particular feedback. So it is possible to have your speech, or at least elements of your speech, or the key ideas of your speech, on a card. And usually, I'm not too sure what the size of paper is. I know the Americans have a different size, but it's generally a quarter of an A4 page is generally the size of the card, and it's only one card. If you are going to use a card, or a note, or a cue card, whatever you want to call it, I think the best thing to do is to have it to the side. Okay, I wouldn't even hold it. I would literally have a desk placed to your dominant side, your left or your right, have the card down sort of at an angle, not flat, so that all you can do is you can glance down at the card and it doesn't interrupt the flow of your speech. Because whilst it is permissible to have a card, generally speeches flow much better without a card, particularly if you're not holding the card in one of your hands. That allows you to have a very open body. It allows you to have gestures as opposed to being bound in one of your hands with a key card. So if you are going to use it, my suggestion, whether it's persuasive or afternoon, is just have it to the side. If you feel like it's a crutch, have it there, have it angled, don't have it flat because you can't see. I don't suggest that you use a phone or a tablet unless you've made sure that the tablet or the phone doesn't go into sleep mode and then halfway through your speech you use your card. Okay. So I think it's a personal preference. I wouldn't penalize somebody who has a key card, but I would certainly be more impressed with somebody who has learned their speech verbatim. In prepared speaking, I just think the nature of it, I know the slide says no props, including audiovisual materials or costumes. I don't think that's a worry. I've never ever seen a speaker use props in persuasive, but I have seen them use it in after dinner. So we'll chat to that when we come to after dinner. I just want to quickly look at the ballot, because we do need to look at what are the guidelines of the speech in relation to the ballot itself. So there, if you look at the ballot, there are basically 4 areas that are going to be judged. Okay, the first 2, obviously the main ones, because that takes up 50% of the mark, and that is the analysis of the problem, which is 30 of the 100 marks, and then persuasiveness of the solution, which is 20. Judges judge differently. So sometimes a judge may take those individual scores, the 30, the 20, the 20, and the 30, perhaps, and give you individual marks, okay, which will then add up to 100. Some judges will give you a holistic mark, okay, where you'll just get, where it says total score, you'll get 88, okay, or you might get 23, 18, 19, 27. And that's individual preference, and there is no rule as to how a judge judges and fills in that particular ballot. But either way, whether you're looking at it from a holistic perspective or individual, a 30, 20, etc., it still needs to inform how you approach the speech. Okay, so analysis of problem is 30 out of 100 marks, or you can see it's a third of the overall mark that you're getting. Hence, it is quite important. That persuades that the solution is less is a bit of an anomaly. I've never quite understood myself. But I like to see that as simply 50% of the mark that you're going to be given is the problem solution approach. Please don't take the 30 and the 20 as indicating which is more important. So like I said at the beginning, the amount of your time that you spend on the problem and the solution is dictated to by the problem and the solution. Don't let it be dictated by the 30 and 20 that are allocated to the problem and solution. The way I see it, it's simply an anomaly, and that 50% of the mark is your content, the problem and the solution. Then, of course, I'm going to skip to delivery. Delivery is also a third, so that's really good. So a third of the speech is how you deliver it, okay? And that reflects what I'd said earlier about how you should use a cue card. So when you've got a cue card or a key card, I'm not sure what you call it, that is going to somehow impact your delivery, unless you follow sort of what I perhaps suggested. Then originality of approach is always an interesting one. There, I think it's probably more aimed at the solution rather than the problem. So if you're going to choose something like climate change, is that an original problem? I probably don't think so, because I think it's something that's always that we see always in the news and our news feeds. But perhaps the originality comes about how you might perceive perceive the problem. Or it could be flipped. We didn't know that this was a particular issue. Well, that's quite original. Whereas the solutions might perhaps be quite obvious or a bit universal. So try introduce a little bit of originality, either in your problem or your solution, or if you can do both, that would be a pretty good idea. One of the several challenges in this competition is that your first round, you've got to go in super strong. It's where a speaker sort of warms up from round one to round two, which generally always happens, does sort of compromise their mark as well. So when you go into your first round, go in confident, go in knowing that you know the speech, that you've rehearsed it, that you've put a lot of research into it, okay? And aim really, really high. Don't go in going, well, I'm going to see how round one goes, and then sort of apply the feedback I get given at the end of round one. Go in at a super high level and try and maintain that sort of level of speaking that justifies the research and the preparation that you've put into the speech. So what I'm going to look at now is perhaps how you sort of approach this problem solution structure for a persuasive speech. So when you're thinking about your problem, I think you need to think of three things that will form part of the analysis of the problem. The first thing is developing for your audience an understanding of the scale of the problem. Okay, so in other words, how widespread is this? Okay, so I think see scale both as widespread and the depth of it. You might have a problem that is widespread but not necessarily serious, or it might be quite focused and therefore the depth of the problem might be quite serious. But I'm sure most problems are both in scale problems because of depth and the fact that they're widespread. The second thing that you need to have a look at is the causes of the problem. Okay, so what has led to this problem? Okay, so it's the origins of the core. Oh, sorry, it's the origins of the problem. And I suppose scale and causes, you would look at how long this problem has been going on for. And within the causes of the problem, what you perhaps could do is speak to the current approaches, okay? Because remember, what you're essentially doing is you're providing a solution. So you're exploring a problem and providing your own solution to that problem. And one thing that does help is to look at what are the current approaches to trying to solve this, and perhaps why they're not working, and why your solution is more viable, more original, more innovative. And the third thing that you can look at as part of your analysis of the problem is, excuse me, what are the consequences of not, well, I suppose the consequences in terms of instances of not addressing this problem, and then the consequences of continuing with the current approaches or current attempts to solve this problem. So therein, that'll give you quite a lot of structure within your problem, and which I think is perhaps lacking a little bit in the guidelines. But that's, I suppose, the purpose of the session, is to give you a sense of the nuances within a guideline that just says, well, it's a problem solution approach. What does the problem mean? What does the solution mean? Which is hopefully what I'm helping you with. So just as a recap, so what you want to look at is scale, okay, the depth and breadth of the problem. You want to look at the causes of the problem, where it originated, okay, the current approaches, okay, which I see as part of the causes, because something that isn't being addressed or is being addressed poorly contributes to the continuation of that problem. And the third thing is what is going to happen if we don't address this problem. Okay, so scale, causes, consequences. Okay, so that's dealing with the problem. Then if we look at the solution, so there are a number of ways, I suppose, to look at a solution. And the most obvious, but by no means the only one, is to look at what, in three ways. what can the people in the room, your audience, actually do to solve the problem? Okay, what can they do to contribute to that solution? Okay, so see that perhaps in local terms, all right, or personal terms. So something, and I use climate change because it's an easy one. So what can the individuals in that room do to help climate change? Can they? Obviously, they can't sort of pass laws, but they can sort of recycle, they can cut their own CO2 emissions. It's that type of thing. Then perhaps what can regions do, or what can national governments do? Okay, but try and see that this progression as each one feeding into another. So what can you do as an individual, and how can you influence your local member of parliament, your councillor, or whatever various sort of governmental governmental officials there are. And then perhaps what can the world do, or what can international bodies do? Try not to be flippant in as much as sort of saying things like, well, governments need to pass laws. Okay, they probably do in the light of climate change, but you need to be specific. Okay, and therein, so whilst I've given you quite a sort of what seems to be quite a rigid approach, is a bit more fluid than it seems. So certainly when you're looking at your solution, so for example, if you can say, if you want to look at, the government of Lithuania needs to pass laws, you can say, well, there are laws already in place, but those laws are not good enough. Okay, so a law was passed in 2020, which does X and Y, but that X and Y isn't good enough. We need to amend that law. We need to pass new laws in 2025 that will help the solution. So don't be flippant in sort of offering sort of one line of solution. So it's like, everybody in this room, you need to recycle. Okay, we need to get our governments to pass laws, and we need to get the United Nations to influence world governments. Okay, so whilst those are, I suppose, legitimate one-liners, you've got to tease out what does it mean for an individual to do something, what do governments need to do, what the international community needs to do. And the solutions do need to be feasible. It is something that should be possible, if not probable. Okay, so it's something that could help. And there is quite an interesting aside to a solution. So, and this doesn't come through in any of the guidelines. It is possible. It's slightly pessimistic, but it is still possible to say there is no solution to this problem, which is an awful, if you think about it, it's an awful thing to say, because you want to say there's this problem, it's terrible, it's going to affect humanity, but there's no solution. Whilst it is possible to say that there is no solution, you've got to make sure that you expand on why there is no solution. It could be that there's no solution right now, and that perhaps, sorry, my dog's in the background, that like in 30 years' time, there might be a solution. Perhaps it's a medical issue, that currently there's this major sort of medical condition that is affecting people. At best, what we can do is just provide money to help people, but ultimately there is no medical solution now. But maybe in 30 years' time, medical technology would have developed that there might be a solution. So don't, in the same way as you don't just have one-liners like, recycle, governments must pass laws, don't just sort of have a one line of a solution that goes, there is no solution. Okay, you do need to go into depth to explain why there is no solution, either forever or that there might be a solution somewhere down the line if certain conditions are met that allows us to find that solution. It's a tricky one to get right, to say that there is in fact no solution. So just be conscious of that it's probably a more challenging thing to try and approach, and also quite depressing if you think about it from a judge's perspective. Okay, so just to tie up now the persuasive I think there obviously, we live in a world where there are lots of problems. I think you probably would want to select a problem that has sort of a certain universality, or perhaps is a problem that if it, perhaps if it is a like a Lithuanian issue, that it does resonate with the rest of the world. Because remember, you're speaking to an international audience, and they do want to. So whilst there is no rule that says you can't speak on sort of Lithuania, I don't know, maybe there's some sort of major erosion of the Curonian spit, I don't know, which is going to flood, the coastal resorts of Lithuania, and maybe that is quite a pertinent problem in Lithuania. But would the Curonian spit be, would that resonate with an international audience? I'm not convinced, but maybe sort of, Russian actions towards Lithuania and the Baltic states, that would have more sort of universal resonance. So it doesn't mean you can't choose a Lithuanian issue, but you would want to choose something that we would all appreciate, rather than go, all right, well, that's really interesting. You spoke about erosion, and we can see how that might have sort of an impact on coastal communities, and terribly tragic, but how would we really feel about that? So I think your problem needs to be a feasible one. Like I said, it can be a future problem, and I think your solution itself also needs to be a feasible one. It's something that could be implemented and certainly could work. So I do think there's a lot of there's a massive scope for the problems that you choose, but I think just be perhaps judicious about the locality, if you like, of your problems. Though I'm not saying that erosion in Lithuania wouldn't be interesting. It's about the resonance with the judges and the overall audience. Okay, so I think that's sort of, for me, pretty much everything for persuasive speaking that I'd like to say. So I don't know if the people online, or Chris, if you've got any sort of questions at this point, or anything I need to clarify before I go on to after dinner.
No, I think it was very extensive, and I think you've covered a lot of extremely important points that we in our prep address to our students. I guess one of the things that really puzzled me down the memory lane was that sometimes you'd see a participant that offers a very technical speech, and I'm talking about the likes of Evan or Jacqueline in the past 2 years, who talk about either the coffee production issues or the way the energy drink market is working, right? Very highly technical issues, but don't necessarily have a very strong emotional appeal. And then I remember 2013 and 2014, both Eleonora about the protection of memory, and then Luluth about LGBT rights, in rest in peace. In 2014, they had a very strong emotional appeal towards the audience, and that worked too. How do you feel? Where's the competition evolving? Are we sort of seeing a dominance of a very technical, very analytical ChatGPT written speech, or how do you go about choosing a topic in that sense?
Yeah, I hear you, and I've also, having been involved, I suppose, for as long as I have noticed, and I think you use the word evolving, but I feel that the competition evolves on the back foot of the international competition. So what becomes acceptable at the internationals is what sort of gets applied retrospectively to worlds. So often over the years, I've sort of what I always thought was a commonly held judging criterion suddenly doesn't seem to be applied anymore, because it's evolved the internationals has sort of evolved away from it. So I do hear you that perhaps 10 years ago, speeches were, persuasive speeches, as you said, were more emotional. And perhaps what we're seeing now is a move away, perhaps from from persuasive speeches that are all, like I said, perhaps pessimistic. So I think Evan, about honey. I think he did honey production. Was it not
Mm.
in 2024?
Last year, that was honey,
Yeah.
and then 23 was coffee beans. Yeah.
So I think I think from a judge's perspective, it is perhaps gives you a bit of a break from sort of 10 to 12 persuasive speeches in a row that are talking about sort of world hunger, world poverty, homophobia, the Russia-Ukrainian war or the Israeli, Palestinian conflict, to something that is perhaps less emotional and, to use your term, technical. And I suppose the advantage of a so-called technical speech that it allows you to do a lot more sort of scientific research in terms of presenting statistics. Do I feel that sometimes those speeches are too statistical heavy? Perhaps they are, but then again, maybe those sort of LGBTQ plus type of speeches were overly emotional. And perhaps there is a middle ground where there is still a lot of research. Statistics are going to be offered, but perhaps, sort of, if we don't look after the honeybees, we're going to, have mass agricultural collapse in the world, which in itself is an emotional concept. So it's actually a difficult question to answer in terms of what is that topic, because the competition is evolving, and I suppose at the end of the day, a technical coffee, honey, energy drinks is quite safe. It's perhaps less triggering, potentially. So if you're going to talk about sort of domestic violence, you certainly could have somebody in the room who's experienced domestic violence. Unlikely somebody who drinks energy drinks in a room is going to feel triggered by being told that energy drinks are bad for you. So yeah, that's sort of as best as I can answer your question.
I was not really hoping for a very precise answer because I mean, the question in itself is quite, difficult to
Yeah.
answer, and that's perfectly fine. I think I'm cognizant of the time we have left today,
Yeah.
so I guess I'll ask everyone to if you have any question towards Shaun, you can ask them in the chat, and then we can move on to after dinner, okay? Because
Okay.
there's still plenty to cover on that end as well, okay?
Okay. Cool. Okay, so moving on to after dinner, which is always my favorite category. So when we're looking at the guidelines, it's even less, you're offered even less structure in these guidelines compared to persuasive, which each tells you the problem solution. And I suppose therein lies another challenge to selecting this category. So once again, to pick up, Chris, on your point about the evolution of speeches, I've seen after dinner evolve from perhaps what I would call a very textbook after dinner to something that is more acted out and very dramatic, which sort of 10, 13, 14 years ago would not have made it to a grand final. But we are seeing grand finals that certainly act and are very dramatic versus a more textbook approach to after dinner, which is interesting. But once again, that comes on, I think we're on the back foot of what is occurring at internationals. So an after dinner speech is meant to be the type of speech that would be offered or presented after an annual general meeting type of dinner, but generally a dinner setting. We do see how that sort of broad sort of overview of what is after dinner has also evolved to perhaps a meeting, perhaps to some sort of convention, some sort of self-help group, or something of the sort. So it's less set after dinner. And what you will find, and I'll come to this when I look at potential speech structure, is some sort of perfunctory reference to food and people. It then goes generally into something that is less sort of after dinner. So yeah, after dinner delivered in theory after a formal dinner to an audience that has some sort of vested interest or identifiable by the speech. So when you are thinking about this your choice of topic, and here I'm going to struggle to find sort of any suggestions for potential topics. It's about having an audience in mind, because remember, an after dinner speech would be to a specific interest group um, from an organization or something of the sort. So you do need to bear that in mind. You don't have to actually identify. One of the nuances is you don't actually have to identify to whom you are speaking immediately. So you could say I'm speaking to the Baltic States Conference. Okay, that's fine. Or it could come through that you are speaking, to a group of Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians, which then you sort of infer is a Baltic States Conference or something of the sort. I really find as a judge, I sort of like to know the actual sort of the audience, because then generally the speech then for me makes a little bit more sense, rather than to sit there and then sort of try and figure out at the end who is the actual audience. Because at the end of the day, every speech is prepared with an audience in mind, and particularly this one where you asked to take on a character. I think the audience is quite important. Okay, so the audience is imaginary. Okay, I've seen instances where an after dinner speaker actually addresses a real potential audience, the United Nations, the British House of Lords, the African Union, which are all legitimate organizations. But sometimes what they might do is they might make up an organization, which then would sort of infer who's that particular audience. So in the past, you've sort of had Bond villains of the world. You've had sort of superheroes unite, or Marvel comics or whatever, and therein lies how you develop the humor. So what I've seen, I'll get to that. Let me just finish this slide first. So both the speaker, the character you choose, and your audience need to be capable of communicating speech. Okay, so that's a weird one. So I remember years and years ago, it was possible. I remember somebody addressed, he was a rock and he was addressing other boulders, which was a bit weird, but it sort of did work. That is now not accepted. So you have to be animate. You have to be animate, and you have to address an animate audience. Okay, so you can't be an inanimate object addressing inanimate objects. The character and the people to whom you are delivering the speech need to be capable of speech. So if you look there, it says non-human audience are acceptable. So vampires, aliens, zombies. If zombies are capable of speech, I don't know. Maybe in your universe they are, which would actually be fine. Animals are not acceptable. So you can't be an animal addressing other animals unless they are literary characters. And that's why if you look at the bottom of the slide, it talks about Animal Farm. So you certainly could be one of the pigs addressing the other pigs. That would be fine. But you can't just sort of, I want to choose horses because I like horses and I'm going to address horses. So unless there's a book that actually has, and you would need to sort of be very overt about that. So if you're going to choose something like Animal Farm, your universe is Animal Farm. You can't say, well, I read a novel where horses spoke to each other, and therefore I'm going to be a horse speaking to other horses. The universe of your sentient animal needs to be in the context of that particular novel or film or something of the sort. So be judicious about sort of who you choose. And that does also lend quite a lot of humor to the particular speech. So if we go to the, I'm just trying to call it the ballot. There we go, after dinner speaking. Okay, so there you'll see that the quality of the theme and the ideas is 40 marks, and the quality of entertainment and delivery is 40 marks. Okay, so the quality of the theme is for me quite essential, because that's sort of what you're going to be choosing. That'll be your the audience you choose, the theme of what you're speaking about. Entertainment and delivery doesn't mean that the people that are listening to you, your fellow speakers, are in fact rolling in the aisles or behind you with laughter. So don't be put off that if you choose after dinner and nobody laughs, that it isn't a good speech. Okay, sometimes humor is so subtle that you sort of laugh on the inside, and don't think automatically that somebody that generates a whole lot of laughs is therefore and essentially a better after dinner speaker. Okay, so the quality of entertainment is how you sort of use the language. Okay, and this is why I think after dinner is a challenge, because it relies on sort of using the puns in English, the double meaning of certain words, and making use of linguistic mechanisms is what generates the humor. I remember there was somebody who was addressing a group of gardeners, and in fact, I think it might have even been Lithuanian, back, I think, in 2010 or 2011. And he incorporated vegetables into all of his speeches. So he spoke about his dog cauliflower. So obviously you know what a cauliflower is, and also you know that there's a dog called collie. There's a dog breed of a collie, and it was called Flower. So that was quite a clever sort of play on words, and that's what you need to sort of think about if you decide to do after dinner. Adherence to format, you'll see, is only 10% of the format, and that just shows you how much freedom there is in the structure, that there isn't a prescribed structure to after dinner, other than perhaps perfunctory acknowledging your audience. And then organizational structure is also only 10%. Okay, so there's a lot of freedom in this particular style, and let's perhaps look at that, how we can sort of develop a little bit of structure there. So perhaps what you would want to do is have some sort of introductory welcome, okay, where you identify yourself, where you identify the audience. And what a lot of after dinner speakers do is they will perhaps make reference to characters within the audience. So, if you're doing, I remember the one was Bond villains. So they would address Goldfinger and various other Bond villains. So, great that you could make it Mr. Blofeld. And sometimes what speakers do, they'll then sort of reference the type of meal. We hope you enjoyed your meal. Like if you're addressing zombies, you might want to say, so, we really hope you introduce your meal of fresh brains or something like that. So generally the identifying of the characters, some reference to food, does help creating that sort of universe that you're trying to create for your after dinner speech. And it helps us identify the audience. One trick that after dinner speakers do is they create an organization. So yes, you can speak to the United Nations, the British House of Lords, existing organizations, but generally speakers will create their own organization. And generally the abbreviation of the organization that they create is a word that resonates with the nature of the speech. So I'm trying to think. Let's say you're at MI6 in London, and you're addressing all of the secret agents, and maybe it's the Bureau of National Detectives, which creates Bond. Okay, so there in itself is a play on this idea that all of these spies are sort of like are James Bond's variants or whatever. So maybe every person is called James Bond, which is why it's the Bureau of National Detectives. Um, so, so there is quite an interesting play on words. Sometimes a a speaker will choose to offer a 5-step plan to becoming a villain. They might say, this is the action plan for the Marvel superheroes to save the world. It might be, 10 ways to become a dictator. Okay. And generally, what they will then do is those 3, 4 steps, or 3 or 4 action plans, or 3 or 4 steps to become something, forms in itself a word, which is then used for effect. It doesn't always have to happen like that, but it does give you a structure within which to work. So if you wanted to, like I said, how to be a good spy, here at the Bureau of National Detectives, here are 4 ways. The first one is, I'm thinking off the top of my head, be secretive. You want to talk about, then you go with like the O could be out, you need to be outcomes based. N could be never give up. And D is, die a good death. Okay, that gives you Bond, just as an example. So whilst there's only 20% based on format and structure, you want to be able to introduce some sort of format or structure into your speech by creating steps or action plans or ways to become a dictator, or there's no end of the possibility of what you can choose as a topic for an after dinner. And like I said, within that structure that you yourself develop, you want to have humor. And remember, so humor isn't slapstick. This isn't a one-liner of comedy. So don't sort of just have lots and lots of funny one-liners all strung together, because this isn't a stand-up comedy routine. It's an after-dinner speech that is meant to be perhaps witty as opposed to rip-roaringly funny. But you introduce the humor through a play on the language, the use of linguistic mechanisms, words with a double meaning in English, amongst other things. So we did allude at the beginning that we've seen a more dramatic presentation in after dinner. And I think that sort of perhaps determines your dramatic presentation, or the dramatic nature of your presentation is perhaps determined by the organization or the nature of your speech. So maybe it does require sort of quite a straight-laced, so if you are doing, Bond, the Bureau of National Detectives, then perhaps you are going to take on a certain persona. But maybe if you're taking on sort of Moms of the World Unite, then you're going to take on a certain persona that helps you deliver that particular speech. One of the unwritten, and it's very unwritten, so nuances are one thing, but this is actually an unwritten nuance, is that judges do like to see some sort of social message coming through, even if it's a very simple one. So if you're doing like Villains of the World Unite, and this is how we take over the world, I suppose the social message there is, there are bad people in the world, and we do need to make sure that they don't get the better of us. But there does need to be some sort of social commentary, even if it's at a very superficial level, even if it is a parody of something, like American cheerleaders, are going to take over the world. That would be, we don't believe that they would, but if this is how they're going to do it, it'll be explained. It's then a parody on I suppose, cheerleaders. So just bear that in mind. And of course, there's no end to the type of topics that you can choose. And therein lies the challenge, is what is going to generate a lot of material for you, what is going to generate humor, what would be appropriate. And I think sort of an appropriate topic is something you need to consider whether you're doing persuasive or after dinner or impromptu or reading for that matter. It's always, what is appropriate. And I don't think there's any value in trying to shock your audience. So I wouldn't want to hear as a judge, like, yes, perhaps in a reading there is perhaps blasphemy, there is swearing, but that's contextual. Something like an after dinner speech, if you would swear or make up an acronym using sort of an inappropriate term, I think judges would look very critically at that, because then it would just be perceived as sensationalism rather than a well-crafted speech, right? So just be sort of very, very conscious of that when selecting your type of topic.
Shaun, can you make your expletives implied though?
So just explain what you mean by that.
So, for instance, you would love to use the F word, but can you express it in a different form that you don't have to spell it out, but everyone understands what follows? Not necessarily that you mimic, but you somehow could put it in a contextual setting that it's still funny, it's still tasteful, and it's not vulgar. How would you feel about something like that?
I think as long as something is appropriate, is tasteful, and isn't vulgar, then it's fine. I think there is a lot of leeway in after dinner and interpretive reading because of that, for different reasons. Obviously, if you're reading a piece that has swear words, you don't omit it because it's the author's intention. Likewise, in after dinner, I think you've got more choice, which is why, as a judge, I would probably be more critical of sensationalism because there is choice. So if you're choosing to read, like I know in a novel, with a rape scene or whatever the case may be, you could choose many other scenes from a book, but from a novel, but maybe that scene is the author's intention and it's the crucial point. Whereas in after dinner, you've got a lot more choice. You don't need to use expletives or be overly vulgar in that instance, because you've got control over the speech, less control over what's in a reading. That would just be my feelings.
I do love my dichotomy, so I'm going to throw you yet another one. Imagine two different speeches. One is exceptionally funny, everyone's laughing their guts out, very loose structure. And speech B has incredibly well-crafted structure, yet nobody really laughs. It's humorous, but it's not funny to an extent that it would make you laugh. How do you feel towards these two speeches? Would you rate one higher than the other, or do you need more context?
Once again, quite a hard question, because I think it would come down to sort of the ballot. Do I feel that one speech is better than another would determine on the quality of the content. Is the humor appropriate? Like I said, it can be very off-putting in an after-dinner room where you come after the speaker before you gets the laughs, people think it's funny, they're crying, it's so funny, and then you deliver the speech where nobody says anything. I think that can be very disconcerting, which is why you've got to be very confident in your in the speech that you deliver. And what it'll come down to is the judging panel. So the speech that is the textbook speech would appeal to a judge, and maybe the other speech would appeal to one. So if you think about the 2023 final, we saw grand final in Durban. We saw three very different after-dinner speeches. So we saw the overly dramatized motivational speech. We saw I think it was the Hong Kong girl gave what I believed was a textbook after-dinner speech. And then there was the South African speaker who was somewhere in between. For me, the textbook speech was the best speech, but the overly dramatized motivational speech won the night. So I don't think there is an answer to that question, because it simply comes down to the judging panel.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't come down to the panel, it comes down to the individual judges who go, well, I think that textbook speech is a 90, and yes, you were funny, but you were just trying to be funny rather than deliver well thought out content. For me, I would always mark somebody down with that is just trying to be funny rather than a well crafted speech that has well thought out content. But that's
Interestingly enough, you mentioned South Africa and the girl from Hong Kong, because 2 years in a row I felt that they had extremely strong candidates with textbook
yeah,
speeches, and none of those speeches won. So
yeah.
that is, it just shows how much the judging panel can vary. Sorry, you wanted to add something, just cut you there.
No, no, I'm just agreeing with you, and it's what you said earlier about sort of the evolution of what is acceptable in a speech. So I think 6, 7, 8 years ago, the Hong Kong speaker probably would have won, whereas the overly dramatized person might have come second or third. But I did feel, yeah, I did feel that I think he was an American boy or a Canadian boy that won afternoon 23 still had substance to his speech. So I'm not saying that he won unfairly, but it was less textbook and maybe more freer interpretation of the criteria. But once again, it's the nature of who appeals, of what appeals to any given judge at the time.
And I think that's the beauty of the competition
I
that
am
we
giving away because I was one of the judges on the grand final panel. So I am telling you who did get my vote inadvertently.
Yeah.
So maybe
Well, I
delete
did
that from
vote.
the recording.
Well, I did vote in the grand final last year of the go after dinner as well. So I couldn't agree more with you. Yeah. So, but that I guess just goes to prove how important in this competition is not only to appeal to technical and expertise judges, but also to the general public, and how much we need to relate and resonate with the general crowd. And I think will try to instill that sort of conception onto our pool of candidates.
Yeah.
It was an extreme privilege today. I'm wary of the time. I think, Shaun, today we had a little bit of a different session from that of Joanne's or Kirsten's, because I didn't motivate you to answer all the necessary questions that were necessary to be answered. So I'm absolutely thankful for everything that you have covered today. I think we've covered not only the technical aspects and the judging aspect, but also the preparatory aspects on how to actually go on about and prepare a speech. Because I think I'm not going to overcomplicate things by saying, but I do think that even though this is a prepared round, there goes in a lot of thinking beforehand on what to put into those speeches. And since you have to be the one who drops your speech, you need to be extremely careful about what do you choose and what do you not. So thank you very much on elaborating a lot more on the structure of a persuasive speech. I think the causes and consequences section for a history teacher are absolutely there to help everyone. Provided we have